Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. This weekend, RaceSim Studio have released their third ground-up mod for Assetto Corsa, this RSS Formula 79. Let's cut straight to the chase here. The first car that RaceSim Studio released for Assetto Corsa was, of course, Formula Hybrid 2017. That car was fictional. It's RaceSim Studio's own interpretation of the 2017 Formula 1 technical regulations. 2017, of course, brand new spec for Formula 1, the return of big front and rear wings, lots of power, big slick tires, wider tires than in previous years. The cars were going to look different, and RaceSim Studio brought us an interpretation of those regulations before the real-world Formula 1 season even started. They set the bar very high for themselves with that mod. Subsequent to Formula Hybrid, RSS also released Formula RSS 2. It's a clone of a real-world GP2/Formula 2 car from 2011 to 2016-2017 spec. GP2 Formula 2 will be using a new car after the 2017 season. However, their third mod for Assetto Corsa is this, RSS Formula 79. Formula 79 is essentially a clone of the 1978 Lotus 79 Formula 1 car. Now, I say clone because it is a clone. This is the Lotus 79. However, RSS have chosen not to market it as the Lotus 79, probably to avoid a whole bunch of trademark and copyright restrictions, things like that. Good idea from these guys, considering they give us top-notch quality content. However, why make a mod of the Lotus 79? This is a very old Formula 1 car. Nobody really cares about old cars when they do sim racing. They want to drive the latest and greatest, don't we? Well, yeah, for the most part we do. However, there is certainly a very important place for these older cars. However, this isn't just any car. The Lotus 79 was the first successful and competitive ground effect Formula 1 car. Ground effect. What is ground effect? Well, to put it simply, it's black magic. Yeah, ground effect is magical, mystical stuff that generates a lot of downforce and it makes you go really, really fast. However, ground effect, we'll get into that in a moment. But first, some history of the Lotus 79, on which this car is very heavily based. The Lotus 79, it was a Formula 1 car designed for the 1978 Formula 1 World Championship by Team Lotus and their design team of Peter Wright, Colin Chapman, Jeff Aldridge, Martin Ogilvy, and Tony Rudd. The car was the first successful and competitive Formula 1 car to utilize ground effect. That is why the Lotus 79 has maintained its legendary status to this day. Technical specs on the car: gone is carbon fiber, gone is Kevlar, gone is all of these aramid composite materials. It's got an aluminum monocoque. Yep, straight up aluminum on this car. It was the lightest material of the era, and that's why they were using it in race cars. It's all welded and riveted together because it's metal. Yes, very old school on this car. However, that was the technology of the era, mid to late 70s, remember. Suspension on this car, it's very different from what we see on modern day Formula 1 cars. Gone are double wishbone push rods, gone are carbon suspension elements. Carbon fiber really hadn't been invented yet. It was only used in research aircraft at this point. It had not made its way into a race car. So suspension on the front, double wishbone, yes, but those wishbones actuate inboard mounted springs and dampers, so no push rod actuators yet on the front end. The rear suspension is even more interesting. It's a multi-link rear suspension on this car. So you've got parallel top links and then lower wishbone, so multi-link top side rear suspension. Then you've got two twin radius arms on each side, and they actuate outboard springs and dampers. So interesting multi-link approach to the rear suspension. The engine on this car, though, this is a little bit more modern. It is, of course, the Ford Cosworth DFV. That was the workhorse customer engine for most Formula 1 teams of the era, so the mid to late 70s all the way up into the early 80s. 3-liter naturally aspirated V8, mid-mounted, longitudinally mounted. It generates about 400 to 450 horsepower. Great engine, legendary for its power and reliability. The transmission on this thing, no flappy paddle, 8-speed, semi-automatic, ridiculous clutch system, none of that computer-generated nonsense. 5-speed manual, courtesy of Hewland. It's a pure race car. It absolutely is the purest of pure race cars from a driving perspective. You've got an engine, you've got a throttle pedal connected to that engine with an actual cable, and then you've got a lever to your right side which moves dog collars around and shift forks and puts the cogs into the right order so that you get more power when you want more power. That's as pure as it gets. The Lotus 79, in terms of its competition history, it served for 2 seasons in Formula 1, 1978 and 1979. Over the course of those seasons, it entered into 26 races. It won 7 of them. It scored podium finishes in 15 of them. It took pole position for 10 of them, and it scored fastest lap in 5 of them. Additionally to those pretty good records, it also won 2 world championships, 1 constructors and 1 drivers. It won the constructors championship for Lotus in 1978, and it also helped Mario Andretti secure his world championship in 1978. Mario Andretti, of course, the last American world champion to date. Car's competition history, yeah, it's pretty good. It's enough for us to remember it because it is a double championship winner for the drivers and constructors. However, the real reason why this car is still so notable to this day is because it didn't quite pioneer ground effect, but it perfected ground effect in a Formula 1 car, and it made it into a race winner and a championship winner. That black magic of ground effect, what is it? Well, let's get into the nitty-gritty of how ground effect works. First of all, ground effect is an aerodynamic concept, just so we're clear. However, when we think about aerodynamics on a race car nowadays, we think of wings. Namely, we think of wings at the front and rear. So let's have a look at this front wing on this, don't call it Lotus 79. Well, here it is. It's very simple. It's a flat plane. It's a single element wing. We've got 2 main planes, one mounted on either side of the nose. Very simple. You'll also notice that the angle of that main plane is pretty shallow, so we're not generating a whole bunch of traditional downforce with this wing. Why would you not want to generate downforce on the front end of the car? I mean, it's pretty important for front end grip and the overall high-speed aero balance, isn't it? You want to make sure those front tires get purchased into the tarmac so that they bite, and then you turn in and you got good grip. You don't have a lot of understeer when you turn in. Yeah, all of that is true, but that's not the aero philosophy of this car. This front wing basically serves more as a spoiler than as a wing. You want to smooth out the airflow as it's heading toward the midsection of the car, and there is a very good reason for this. Once the air passes over this front wing, it is immediately gobbled up by the side pods on this car, and you see here through the gap underneath the upper wishbone on the front suspension. Yeah, that's the inlet for the radiators, sure, but underneath that radiator inlet is where all of that black magic resides. That's where the ground effect happens. If we move toward the rear of the car, you will see presently 2 gigantic tunnels underneath this car. Now, we've got a center section of the car which is much lower to the ground than the outboard sections of the floor. It almost looks a little bit similar to a modern-day Formula 1 floor, where you have a step plane in there. You've got the plank on the lowest section of the floor for legality reasons, and then you have a step plane and then the reference plane, which is a slightly higher element of the floor. Yeah, we're all familiar with that. That's not what's happening here, though. There were basically no regulations governing the shapes or sizes of any stepped planes or any other changes of height of the bottom of the car in this era. So Lotus, being innovators, they decided, is it possible to turn the bottom of the car into a wing, and then to turn that wing upside down and generate a whole ton of downforce with it? Well, the simple answer to that question is yes, of course it's possible to do that. And if you've got the budget and you've got the engineering know-how, you can achieve it, and that's exactly what Lotus did. You'll notice the overall shape of this car. It's a wedge. Cars in the 80s, be they road cars or race cars, they all have this generic wedge shape to them, and there's a reason for this. Is it to look good? Not necessarily. I think a lot of us tend to look at these cars with the rose-colored glasses and we say that they look really great, and they do look good. They look good in their own ways. They look very dated because we all do associate this shape with the late 70s and all the way up to the mid-80s and even early 90s when we talk about road cars being wedge-shaped. But that wedge shape exists for a very specific purpose. If you have a car that flares up at the nose and then rises to a uniform height across the top of the chassis. That means that the airflow is going to be more so concentrated underneath the car, and that is where all of this magic starts to happen with that downforce generation. Ground effect works on Bernoulli's principle, meaning that as air increases in its speed, the pressure that it exerts on adjacent surfaces decreases. Now, if you want downforce, doesn't downforce work by pressing down on the car and creating more grip by making the car hunker down in that direction from pushing it down from the top? Well, yeah, that's how downforce works on a wing car, but when we're talking about underbody aero and ground effect, the exact opposite happens. Yes, the air comes in through the front end of this car, as you can see, passes over the front wing, and then it gets funneled into the tunnels underneath the car. However, when the air is now underneath the car going through those tunnels, the tunnels are designed in such a way that the airflow accelerates as it passes through them. The top sides of these tunnels are flared upward in an airfoil shape, just like an aircraft wing. However, picture an aircraft wing inverted, so the curved section of the wing is now facing down toward the ground. That's what's happening underneath this car. As the air passes over that airfoil, it accelerates, and as the airflow accelerates, it decreases the pressure that it's exerting on the adjacent surface, meaning that it creates an area of low pressure, an area of suction underneath the car, and therefore the car is pulled down from the bottom toward the racetrack, and the whole car hunkers down as the speed increases. It pushes those tires into the tarmac, thus generating a whole ton of grip. That's the idea of ground effect in principle. However, there's a problem with this. As the air is funneled into those tunnels, sure, it's fine. It's a brilliant solution. The airfoil is going to do its job. The airflow is going to accelerate as it passes through those tunnels. However, there comes a point of critical mass. When the speed gets high enough, the airflow is going to overwhelm the surface area of those tunnels, meaning that the air no longer has any place to go and expand into those tunnels and then be shot out the back of the car. This means that the air is going to start spilling out the sides of the car, around the sides of the side pods here. And that's not good. That's going to kill any more downforce generation, and worse still, it could generate lift, which could actually cause the car to come up off the ground, and that's the exact opposite of what you want. So, enter another innovation: skirts. You see along the side of the side pod here, just below the very cheeky Olympic Cameras logo, there are a few livery Easter eggs on this car that I will point out. However, just below that logo, you can see a section of the side pod protruding toward the ground. That's a skirt. For those of you who are not quite as familiar with the early 80s, the idea of a skirt is to seal the undertray. When you seal the undertray, the air does not spill out from the sides of the car around the edges of the side pods and create vortices and, at worst, lift. However, the skirt is more than that. What the skirt was able to do was it came down from the side of the car and it actually touched the ground. It's designed to do that. But more so than just touch the ground, the skirt is articulated in a way that allows it to rise and fall and follow the undulations in the tarmac over bumps, over crests and dips, and also to maintain consistent contact with the ground as the car is in different moments of heave or roll. So it's longitudinal and latitudinal attitude. The skirt will always be in contact with the tarmac. This is absolutely important. If the skirt is going to seal the undertray sufficiently, it must be in contact with the ground. So having that articulation, allowing the skirt to rise and fall with either the attitude of the car or with the overall configuration of the tarmac, that enables the undertray to be sealed, and therefore, at very high speeds, even though there's a whole ton of air being forced through these tunnels, more air even than the tunnels can even handle, it keeps the air from spilling out the sides of those tunnels, and therefore it forces it to be fed through the tunnels and then shot out the back of the car at incredible speed. This creates that suction, that zone of low pressure under the car. The whole car hunkers down, and that is what gives the car its grip. That front wing doesn't do a whole lot of work, neither does this rear wing. You'll see the rear wing doesn't have that severe an angle to it either. Yeah, there is a little bit of downforce generated by those front and rear wings, but for the most part, this is not a wing car. The entire car is a wing. The whole center section of this car, anyway, it's a wing. It's an inverted aircraft wing, basically, in theory. So, as the airspeed increases through the bottom of this car, the downforce also increases, because the faster the air flows through those tunnels, the lower the pressure it exerts on the car above it, meaning that the car hunkers down into that area of suction underneath and it's stuck to the road. That's the idea of ground effect in a race car. However, this is passive ground effect. It relies on the car being driven through clean air, obviously moving forward, for this theory to work, and the faster the car goes, the more downforce it generates. However, there were also two notable attempts at active ground effect in racing history. They are, of course, the Chaparral 2J from the mid-1960s in Can-Am, and the Brabham BT46B from Formula 1. The Chaparral 2J, those of you who have seen that car, it is hideously ugly. It's a brick with a nose cone and four wheels. Yeah, that's what it is. It generates effectively no topside aero at all. All the magic happens underneath. It uses ground effect just like this Lotus 79, or Formula 79 if we want to be politically correct. However, the difference on the Chaparral 2J is that in addition to a big 5-liter Ford engine generating all the motive power for the rear axle, it's also got a 90 horsepower snowmobile engine in the back. And no, that's not for a 1960s version of KERS. That is for running two fans mounted in the back of the car, which are connected to air ducts which feed the under tray. Those fans pull air from underneath the car, thereby creating that suction and getting that airflow started through the tunnels. Sitting still, the Chaparral 2J could generate downforce. Yeah, that's active ground effect. The other attempt was the Brabham BT46B. That was a Formula 1 car that was immediately banned after it won its first and only Grand Prix in Sweden. That car is known as the fan car because, just like the Chaparral 2J, it had a big fan at the back driven off of the gearbox. Now, the designers at Brabham got away with that because they said the fan was for cooling, and technically speaking, the primary purpose of that fan was for cooling. About 50.1% of the fan's airflow went to cool the engine, and then the remaining percentage went to go and pull air underneath the car. So, both the Chaparral 2J and the Brabham BT46B could generate downforce at a standstill, and that meant that not only could the car go around corners extremely fast, but the drivers also had the ability just to floor it and dump the clutch and just do a full 1.5G start off the line, because there's no way you're getting wheel spin in a car like that. It just has so much force already sucking it down onto the ground from the word go. Obviously, active ground effect was banned in Formula 1, much to everybody's disappointment. And then other racing series followed suit, and there hasn't been a so-called fan car ever since. However, the amount of performance that is available from ground effect, both passive aero, as we see here on this RSS Formula 79, as well as in active aero, as we see in Adrian Newey's Red Bull X Series cars, there's a lot of performance potential there, and it's an area that really hasn't seen any development in the real world since the 1970s. And it's really, really frustrating for me because I love engineering. I love seeing what things are really capable of doing when you push their limits. So I would love to see active ground effect come into some racing series again. Will we ever see it? Probably not, because the same concerns come up again. How much cornering force can the cars generate? Can the drivers even survive those G-forces? What happens in an accident when you get it wrong going through, I don't know, a hairpin turn at 130 miles an hour, because that's what you could do with active ground effect. Yeah, a lot of problems start to come up, but we have seen it before, and it is an area of development which is still really, really cool. However, enough about the technical jargon of ground effect. It's very important to understand. However, that was a very long explanation. What have RaceSim Studio given us in this car? Well, they set the bar very high with Formula Hybrid and Formula RSS2 from a visual standpoint, and they have not disappointed us here on Formula 79. As I mentioned, this car is made of aluminum panels bolted and welded together, so no carbon fiber mesh and things like that to detail, but you can see these very smooth body lines on the car, great reflections. You can see the rivet heads where the two body panels in some sections of the car are bolted together. absolutely awesome detail from a visual standpoint alone on this car. Moving around, you can see that front suspension that we talked about. You can't see the dampers or anything because they're inside the bodywork, but you can see the upper and lower wishbones. You can see the brake ducts punctuating the front end there. Very, very nice modeling once again, guys. Absolutely love it. Getting in closer toward the wheels, you can see the inboard sides of the brake calipers just behind the brake ducts there. Absolutely great. Moving to the wheels themselves, a nice split rim design on this, and you can look inside the wheel there and you can see the brake rotor, steel rotors on this car, and just traditional ceramic brake pads. Carbon fiber brakes had not been invented yet, so steel brakes on these cars. However, they were still pretty powerful, I must say. Looking around to the midsection of the car, you can see the radiators and the radiator outlets. These are basically proto-chimneys. Remember the chimneys that we saw on Formula 1 cars in the mid-2000s? They were exhausting that radiator air from the side pods. That's what's going on here too, but rather than sculpting a very impressive-looking chimney device and integrating turning vanes into it, nope, just cut a big hole in the top of the side pod and let the air fly out. Yep, that's what's going on. A little bit of downforce generation with this as well, but the primary purpose is just to evacuate that hot air after it passes through the radiator matrix and cools that water to keep the engine happy. Moving toward the rear, I mentioned that multi-link rear suspension. You can see it here, and you actually see it functioning as well in the replay views when you're out on track. Really, really great. Also, you'll see brake discs mounted inboard on this car, and the reason for that is it was pretty common in the 70s and early 80s in Formula 1 to mount those brake discs inboard. The Tyrrell P34, for example, the six-wheeler, also has rear-mounted brake discs mounted inboard there. But the idea here is to minimize what's called unsprung weight. Unsprung weight is anything that sits outside the boundary of where that rear suspension is in terms of the dampers. So on a modern Formula 1 car, all of your dampers are mounted basically in the middle of the suspension elements. That means that the rest of the suspension, the wheel and the tire, it's all unsprung weight, and any other bodywork that is mounted outboard of that suspension is also unsprung weight. So if you're able to move heavier components toward the midsection of the car and keep them inboard of the suspension dampers, that is now sprung weight, which means the suspension can absorb not only the weight of all of those components, but it can also absorb the dynamic loadings that the extra mass of all of those components generates. So mostly heave moments as the car moves up and down over bumps and things like that, or in the case of a car like this, as it hunkers down as the downforce starts to build. But those brake discs and the calipers, they're very heavy components. If you can keep them inboard of the suspension, you minimize the unsprung weight and you just keep the overall center of gravity and overall moments of inertia of the car under control. Very nice detail. Moving around top side here, you can see the exhaust outlets for that Ford Cosworth engine, that 3-liter DFV V8. Those exhaust outlets, they don't look like much, but when the car is on track, they actually vibrate. You can see the exhaust moving around on some of the replay cameras for this car. It is absolutely phenomenal. It's the first time I've seen a detail like that. I was absolutely blown away at being able to see the suspension dampers move on Formula RSS 2 on the rear. This is even cooler than that. I've never seen the exhausts move on a mod before, so that's absolutely fantastic. Moving back down here toward the gearbox casing, you can see the rain light. It's operable. It's not very bright because we're just talking about an incandescent bulb behind a plastic fairing, but that's your rain light. Turn it on and off, as you can see. Very, very cool detail. And it also functions as a brake light while you're out on track. So you get on the brakes and the light comes on. Very cool. Moving toward the shadowed side of the car, great reflections across the flat surfaces of the bodywork, and there are a lot of flat surfaces on this car, such is the geometry of that under tray. But we can also see that cockpit very nicely, and let's go in. Flying across the side of the car here, and into the cockpit. We're a little high in terms of the eye point, but in terms of where we are relative to the dashboard, we're pretty much at the distance from where we'll be driving. So you can see the overall sight lines and you can start to get your bearings in here. The bodywork comes up pretty high around you, but the wheels are all mounted pretty low, so there's nothing really obstructing your vision in or out of the corner, so really nice visibility throughout. Looking at what we have in the cockpit, it is of the era. This is late 70s, so no computers, no digital displays, none of that nonsense, no steering wheels with 40 buttons on them. It's effectively a road car steering wheel. You've got a dial in the middle, which shows you how fast the engine's spinning. You've got another dial showing you your water temperature and your oil pressure, and that's it. You've got a couple switches off to the left. You've got a switch for ignition and then a switch for the rain light. You've got a fire button on the right hand side of the dash, and then you've got another switch below that I can't quite read, but that's what's going on in the cockpit. There are your controls. Over on the left hand side of the cockpit, you've got a brake bias adjuster, and then over here you have an adjustment for the front suspension. So you can make the front dampers softer or harder as you so desire. Really, really cool. Over on the right hand side of the bulkhead, there's your gear lever, and you can see that they've gone through the trouble to include there in the textures a hand-drawn shift pattern, and I'm sure that Formula One teams actually did this. Back in these days, drivers were not necessarily contracted to run for an entire season, so you might have multiple people driving this car at different times. So if someone's a little unfamiliar with the car, there's your shift pattern. Any questions? Good. You can see there, reverse is up where you might expect first gear to be, and then first is a dog leg back toward you, and then 2, 3, 4, 5. Very, very cool. Straight up 5-speed manual gearbox. This is as pure as a race car really should ever be, but is as pure as it gets. Moving around to the sides of the top side bodywork, all in fiberglass, and you can see the texturing there. Very nice. You can see the bolts that hold the wing mirrors in place. Very cool. I love that detail. And then moving back in the cockpit, looking down, you can see a seat and seat belts have been modeled there. You can see the weave in the fabric of the seat belts, and you can see that the seat is also fiberglass. Moving around toward the back, you see more rivet heads, and you see a roll bar. You don't see a big air snorkel on this car. The engine's fed through the side pods. So you've just got a roll hoop here, and then you can see clear back across to the rear wing. And of course, you've got those massive rear tires as well. Very, very cool stuff. Around the other side of the cockpit, the detail looks just as good. And here you can see the RSS Formula 79 chassis plate. Very nice touch. I like that. Shows that these guys have a lot of pride in their work. I love it. Moving back toward the business view. I love this steering wheel. Not only is it a very simplistic steering wheel, but you can see it's not exactly pristine. It looks like it must have been dropped a few times, and you can see some scratch marks on the front face of it, maybe where the wrench has scratched some of the paint off, where they're tightening it into the car. Absolutely great stuff. And you do notice a switch on it. That's probably an engine kill. Remember, actual throttle cables in this era, and they did have a tendency to stick sometimes. So if you're running around in a place like Monaco and you're coming down the start-finish not so straight, and you realize you've got a stuck throttle, by the time you can even think to do something about it, you have crashed into the barriers on the outside of Saint-Devote. So the best way of dealing with that would be to kill the engine, and the fastest way you could possibly do that is to put an engine kill on the steering wheel, have the driver with the ability to stop the car, and then maybe get it going again if he can get his throttle unstuck. But there you go. Engine kill on the steering wheel. No 45 buttons, no LCDs, no fail mode 17, nothing like that. Very cool. This is as pure as it gets. Coming out of the cockpit for the last time, and now just one final look around the exterior of the car before we go drive the thing, of course. Now, yes, this is a review video, and we're going to review the car. We're going to talk about how it handles, but this is the first time in Assetto Corsa that we've had a really competently made ground effect car. Now, yeah, the Porsche Le Mans cars, the older ones, the 962s, they're also ground effect cars, but they work a little bit differently. They don't have skirts, per se. This has skirts, and it's a Formula One car, so it's smaller, it's a bit faster on acceleration, it's better in the corners, so this is the first time that we have a really zippy car that generates most of its grip via downforce generated by ground effect. So we have a little bit of a different driving experience. The way that this car generates its downforce is completely different, and the way you can use that grip is also different. So yes, we're going to review the car, but we're also going to talk about how it feels, because it's different, and you'll see what I mean. However, I thought about where we could take this car to review it, and I thought, yeah, we have some older tracks in Assetto Corsa. We've got the old versions of Monza and Silverstone, for example, and they're great tracks. But I think they're a little bit boring, and I don't think they particularly suit the car well, because Silverstone is just flat out every corner, and it's not a big challenge. Monza, same thing, you're flat out every corner, and it's not a big challenge. So we're going to take this thing to Mugello, because it's a modern track, yes, but it's still got a lot of fast and flowing corners where the ground effect can really come into its own. So we're going to take this thing to Mugello, and we're going to give it a good shakedown and show you what's what on the RSS Formula 79. Stand by for Mugello. We'll see you there in just a moment.
Welcome to Mugello.
As always, before we get out on track, we're going to have a look through the setup screen and show you what is what on the RSS Formula 79. Here on the gear screen, you see that wonderful 5-speed Hewland manual gearbox. No flappy paddle, computer-controlled, semi-automatic nonsense here. It is a gear stick, and it does what you want exactly when you tell it to do it. It's marvelous. There is no better control in any car, be it a race car or a road car, than a traditional manual gearbox. Of course, you got your gear ratios first through fifth plus final drive. You can adjust these in any shape, manner, or form that you so desire. You see, on default gearing, we're topping out in fifth gear at 158 miles per hour. The straight line speed in this car is quite slow. And this might be a surprise to some of you, but think of it. You've got 450 or so horsepower. You've got a ton of drag generated by those tunnels underneath the car, so that's about where it tops out. This car was faster than its opposition in the corners for sure. Tires, you get two compounds of your choosing. You get the soft, which is the default, or the hards. Honestly, the difference between the soft or the hard tires on this car is not as big as you might think, because the car is generating downforce, and that's it. So you can use any tire compound you really want. Yes, the softs are going to be faster, they heat up better, they're better for quality runs and short race runs, but there's not that much of a difference between the two compounds, not as much as, say, on a more modern car. Tire pressures here, default values. Note the higher front tire pressures on the default setup. Fuel defaults to 30 liters. We've got it 0 right now to keep the engine quiet, but the maximum fuel capacity of the car is 168 liters, and you can see how the car hunkers down when I put that fuel in, and of course when I remove it, it pops back up ever so slightly. Aero front and rear wings. You can see that the default setup has the wings dialed all the way up to the maximum on the front and rear, 12 and 2 respectively. However, you can go all the way down to 0 on the front wing, or all the way down to 0 on the rear wing, as you can see. You don't see the flap angles changing as you make the adjustments, however the effects are modeled, but they're not as precipitous as you might expect, because this car is generating downforce from that center section underneath, remember. Brakes, your brake bias and brake power settings, they are what you think they are. These are the default values here, 51% of power to the front. Drivetrain, diff adjustments in power coast and preload. Suspension, the alignment settings, camber and tow on all four corners. The damper screen, your bump, so your bound and rebound here on all four corners. Default values shown, 5s across the board. Suspension and roll, here you've got your front and rear anti-roll bars, your wheel rates, ride heights, and travel ranges for all four corners. Under various, there's your power steering setting. This car didn't have power steering as far as I know, so I'll keep it at default. That's it for the setup screen, and you know what? The default setup on this car is actually quite good. So we're going to do our first run here on the default setup, but we are going to put the hard tires on. Other than that, though, we're just going to put, I don't know, let's go for 25 liters of fuel, just a couple of shakedown laps here for our first run, and then we'll put the softs on it later on. But we're not going to touch anything else. And let's go and see what's up with Formula 79. I did mention that I was going to point out a couple more livery Easter eggs. Well, here they are. We mentioned the Olympic cameras. Obviously, those are Olympus cameras. And on the side here, RaceSim Studio, that would be the John Player tobacco livery on the real car. Above that, on the roll hoop, you've got Valve Lane. Obviously, a very, very thinly veiled plug for Valvoline there, the oil and fuel supplier. So, yep, there are some very cool Easter eggs on this car. And additionally, they do not want to market this car above all else as a Formula 1 car for the mod. However, when you look at the nose, you see Formula, which is obviously, it means Formula 79, obviously it does, but you see Formula, and then this car happens to be number 1, so I don't think you have to be too prestigious a deducer to figure out what's going on there. However, in the cockpit, now that everything has come to life here, you see the tach showing us we're idling at just above 2,000 RPM. The water and oil temperatures are up. Everything is ready for our run. Here's our view. It's a nice one. No obstructions, and certainly no halo business going on. However, we will add a little bit more instrumentation for you. We'll have a gear display in the lower right, considering you can't see on the steering wheel what gear I'm in. And of course, as always, we'll have the pedals in the lower left. So without further ado, clutch in, first gear, and off we go in Formula 79. We'll just be cautious here, get everything warmed up.
and you can see a tattletale on the tachometer just below 7,000 RPM. That red line, that is our peak RPM so far on this run. Of course, when we're winding it out, we'll be shifting at over 10,000 RPM. Remember, no pneumatic valve springs yet in this era, so the valve springs, the mechanical coil springs in the engine, they could really only reciprocate at equivalent speeds up to 10,500 RPM or so. So that was the physics-imposed rev limit in this era, about 10.5, 10.6. The Ferraris were able to rev slightly higher, up to about 12,000 with their flat 12 engines, but that's about it. And then someone got the bright idea of, why don't we make pressurized valve springs? And then revs went into space. Some nice sounds from that Cosworth DFV. And we're not even really in the power band yet. So bringing things up to temperature gradually here. See, when we get up to about 8,000 RPM on the tach, the engine really starts to howl. It's a great noise. Full revs on that 3-liter V8. To turn 1. Turn 2 will keep it in third here. Not going for it by any means yet. Into fourth. It's such a great noise from that motor. Here's a taste of ground effect for you. You know what other car these two corners are flat in? Ferrari F-2004. Just to give you some sense of perspective. So now everything is well and truly up to temperature. We can start to make some observations on the baseline default setup, which I must say is quite good by itself. So coming down the straight, you can actually feel the car start to hunker down as the speed builds and the air gets rammed through those tunnels underneath. In your mind's eye, at least I do this, when I'm driving a car, particularly an aero car, I start to picture the front and rear of the car working separately, yet in harmony. I can visualize this in my brain. I can almost see the air passing over those wings, and I can sort of predict what it might do. However, in this car, my mind's eye is less drawn toward the ends of the car, so the front or rear, but it's more so drawn to the center. This car feels very centered. Perhaps you could say it's zen, but all of the force that you feel as the car hunkers down, as that downforce builds, it's not on the front or the rear, it's in the middle. And that makes perfect sense in a way, because where are those tunnels? Well, they're in the middle. So all of that pressure is being distributed evenly across the center section of the car. The front and rear wings really don't have all that much effect, to be quite honest. Third gear. Roll onto the throttle on the exit. A little bit of understeer. Let it go. Grab fourth a little early. hit the apex, let it track out wide here. You can go very wide over the curbs in this car. Because we saw the bottom, you saw how far recessed those tunnels actually are relative to the true bottom of the car, that center section. You're not going to bottom this car in terms of where the tunnels are, so you can feel free to use the curbs all you want. It's not really affected by them. Of course, really high curbing would be a problem, like the big sausage curb on the exit of turn 1 at the Red Bull Ring. But aside from that, use the curbs. Car's happy with it. How does it feel through the low speed stuff? On default setup, feels absolutely fine. No problem whatsoever, but you will notice I'm fighting the steering a little bit through these low speed corners, and that's fighting the steering a lot of bit. Just like a wing car, speed influences downforce in this thing, and downforce squares with speed, and so does drag. But the faster you go, the more downforce you're going to be generating, whether it's with a wing or, in this case, with underbody tunnels. So the faster you go, the more stable the car feels. Like through here, these high-speed corners, the car feels absolutely rock steady, no problems, tons of confidence straight away. And in a car that's this old, to be able to take these corners flat, that's really impressive. The Ferrari 312 can't do that, I'll tell you that much. But you see there in that transitional zone around 100 miles an hour, the car does get unstable when you start to get the throttle back in. So, yeah, you do have to be cognizant of where you are in terms of how fast you're going. Default setup at high speeds feels absolutely rock steady. However, at low speeds in that transitional zone between the mechanical and aero grip, like right here, there's your instability. So we'll dive into the pits here. We'll dive into the pits and we will put my setup on the car. Of course, I've made little tweaks here and there, but I said that overall, the default setup feels good, and I'm not lying about that. It truly does feel pretty good. So, here's my setup. Watch the car a little bit. Hunkers down a little bit more. I've lowered the ride height slightly. I've also lengthened the gearbox slightly so that I get a little bit more straight line speed. Soft tires now on the car. I've kept the pressures the same. Fuel at 30 liters, that's really enough. I mean, we'll run for a while on 30 liters of fuel. The car's actually fairly economical, believe it or not. I've also lowered the wing angle, so the front wing angle's gone down by 2 clicks, and the rear wing angle has gone down by 1 click. Again, the wings don't really influence this car all that much. I could probably get rid of more wing, and it would be fine. I've driven this car at Monza on no wing at all, and it feels absolutely fine. Brake bias, haven't touched it, haven't really touched the diff. I've added a little bit more coast diff, I think, but preload and power are the same. No adjustments to the suspension whatsoever, either in the alignments, the dampers, or in pitch and roll. So, yeah, default setup still pretty much the way to go here. We'll head back out. And we'll really begin the run now. And of course, I should mention we are now on the soft tire, so a little bit more grip through some of the low-speed corners. Of course, they're cold at the moment, so we won't have much. Oh yeah, drifts. Drifts happen. More drifts happen. Again, those tires are cold. You got to be really careful, though, when the car does start to step out, because you've got so much rubber on the ground. These big, fat, late 70s slicks, they just grab at every possible opportunity. So if the rear end slides, yes, you do want to steer into that slide as you would for correcting for oversteer. However, don't countersteer too much, because the fronts are going to grip before you know it, and it's going to spit you off in the other direction. So just be aware of that. If you are somebody like me who tends to saw at the wheel a bit when you get oversteer, just back it down a notch. Grab fourth early. All right, the tires feel good now. A little bit of understeer mid-corner, no problem. And down the straight. Straight line speed will be up a little bit. Not much. Now braking into turn 1, down 2 gears. To the apex, make a late apex. Now feed the power in progressively. Keep it in third for turns 2 and 3. Use the curbs all you want, but be advised the car will be skatey through here just like that. Yep. Back on the power, bit of a power slide on the exit. It's glorious. Here's the ground effect coming in. Again, when you lower the ride height like I did, you further increase the speed of that air as it goes through the tunnels, which means that you get even more suction under the car. Hesitate on the throttle, let the car go. Short shift into fourth again for the chicane. Wide over the curbs. Do that all day long. It does not care. Hesitate, hesitate. Now. So, we're now well established in this run. How does it feel? Well, with my setup changes, really, it only influences what the car does aerodynamically. So at speed, when the ground effect starts to come in, it feels even more stable than it did on default because I'm lowered the ride height, and therefore I've got the air moving under the car even more quickly as it's being compressed and sped up by that airfoil. So, yep, I've got more aero grip through the high-speed corners, so the car feels even more stable. Mechanically, though, as you can see, it is still quite skatey in these medium-speed sections, so just be aware of that. However, just like a modern Formula 1 car, it feels absolutely terrible at low speeds, and then when you build up the confidence to be able to push the car through the corners, it all just sort of settles down, and there it is. You got to trust the downforce. And this was probably the first car where that maxim, trust the downforce, became true. Because, yeah, it's got a lot of downforce. It is generating far more downforce than its own weight, for sure. So, yeah, trust it. You won't think it's going to stick, especially when you remember how old this car is, from 1978. How many of us have road cars from 1978 anymore? Not many. And those of us who might, you might miss some modern amenities, like seat belts. But you do have to sort of readjust your brain when you drive this car. Yes, you know how old it is, but at the same time, it feels surprisingly up to date. Straight 150 miles an hour. Straight line speeds, like I said, not that impressive, but the grip through the corners certainly is. 40 years old. 40 years old. And you can throw it into a corner like that. That's something. That is something. Feeling that car hunkered down in this infield straight. Control the slide out of the corner. Grab fourth. A little bit of trail braking, blending the throttle and brake, left foot braking there. And then control the slide through there. Flat out. Engine's crying at this point. Please upshift, not a chance. Wind it all the way out. Downhill braking, chuck it in. A little bit of opposite lock needed. Chuck it in through here as well. Get on the power now. And just be aware of what the aero's doing. talking about my mind's eye before, just sort of visualizing what the airflow is doing and where the downforce is coming in. My mind's eye is being drawn basically to the roll bar right behind where the driver's head is. That feels like the center of pressure in this car. So yeah, that's pretty much dead in the middle, and it's exactly where you would expect that download to be with those tunnels. Overall, the other feelings on this car: force feedback through my Thrustmaster TSPC wheel, great, really high definition, and it's strong, but it's not too strong. I haven't made any adjustments to my force feedback settings for this car, and I don't really think I need to. It feels really great. Another wonderful feeling car, force feedback wise, from the guys at RSS. Really awesome. Also, I've got to say, this is the first car that RSS have made that has a manual gearbox. Wonderful little gearbox. It's very peachy, as one Martin Brundle might say. By the way, get well soon, Martin. We miss you. But great action there on that gearbox. It doesn't hunt around. The shift times are exactly what you are inputting with your controls, so there's no artificial lag built into it. It's really great. Really great. And yes, you can miss gears, so heel toe is a must. Double clutching sometimes at low speeds, even if you're into that sort of thing. You don't necessarily have to, but you can do a double clutch at low speeds. Just keeps everything a little bit smoother. Four-wheel drift there. When the back end breaks free, it does give you enough warning where you can sort of almost preemptively catch it, but you've got to be quick. It gives you a brief moment of, hey, I'm about to spin, do something, and then it spins. So you've got to be very in tune with what this car is telling you at all times. You definitely have an intimate relationship with this thing. There's a lot of communication through the sounds, through the force feedback, and just with what your eyes are picking up as you're going along. And when the back end breaks free, you do feel that through the force feedback as well. Steering gets a little bit lighter, and you just know what's about to happen. So awesome implementation from that chassis dynamics translated into force feedback. But through these corners, you really see how that ground effect works. Just zooming along. And then through here, the transitional zone. Relying on the tires, now relying on the aero. That's a drift. How did that one get caught? I don't know. This car is better than me, I'll tell you that much. Another drift. You see, it is a little bit tail happy. It is a little bit tail happy. However, coming down the straight, listening to that engine sing, and then brake as late as you dare. Remember, steel brakes. So it does not quite feel like you've run into a reinforced concrete wall like a modern car does. It just feels like you've run into a regular old brick wall. So you gotta play with the throttle and play with the steering when that back end breaks free, but you've gotta be careful. Like I said, those fronts will grab in an instant, and then you'll know all about it in the worst way possible. The only thing the car's not particularly sensitive to when it does get into those oversteer moments is your throttle. Yeah, you got to make sure you don't spin the wheels up, but from an aerodynamic standpoint, we're not blowing any diffusers or blowing any wings with the exhaust flow, so you don't have to keep the revs up through the corners like you do in maybe the Williams FW14, for example. You just deal with the throttle like you would in any other car in an oversteer situation, and it'll be fine. You don't have to be cognizant of where the revs are, for example. speaking of the engine, it's a wonderful engine. It's a very linear engine. Power comes in above 7,000 RPM for the most part, and then it's very linear all the way up to redline. Torque comes in pretty high, I would say about 8,500 RPM, and then maximum power is probably around there as well. So it's a pretty one-to-one relationship with what you do with the throttle and how the engine responds. Bit out of position there for the turn in, got away with it. Lead the power in, control the slide. It's a wonderful car. I don't drive vintage cars so much, at least not this era, because, well, up until now, we really haven't had anything that's particularly fun in Assetto Corsa. Yeah, we've had the Ferrari 312T, and it's a decent car, it is. It recently got an update with the last AC update, but it just feels kind of slow. It feels heavy. It feels sluggish all around. The engine power, yeah, it's got decent engine power, but the acceleration isn't there. The cornering isn't quite there. It's all mechanical grip. The aero on that car pretty well sucks, but this car really sucks. Literally. It sucks itself to the track tremendously. And it means you could do this in a car that's 40 years old. That's incredible. I have no idea what lap times I'm doing. I don't have a clock in here. I don't even know how fast I'm going aside from the HUD display. All I really know is my engine RPM and the water temp, which is fine by me. I don't really care. I don't want to be bothered by all that stuff all the time. Like I said, it's pure. It's as pure as it gets. You know what the engine's doing, and you know what you're doing. And that's all that matters, really. I'll also say this. I drove a real race car. I drove a Formula 2000 car. And in terms of the view from the cockpit, in terms of the instrumentation that you have in one of those, this is it. This really is it. Yeah, of course, this car's a lot faster. It's got a whole lot more power. It's got a whole lot more grip. I ran basically on road tires. This one's running on big slicks. This one's got 450 horsepower. My car had 120 horsepower. But, you know, manual gearbox, tachometer in the middle. Open cockpit, open wheel, little mirrors that you can't see much out of. Yeah, this really brings me back there. It really, really does. And that to me is the mark of something really great. This Lotus 79, RSS Formula 79, whatever you want to call it. I'm officially calling it the RSS F-79, but whatever you want to call it, it's going to put a smile on your face. That much I will promise you. Whether or not you remember these cars running back in the day, whether or not you're a fan of this particular era of Formula One, this car is going to be special. And it's going to be one that really, I think, puts RaceSim Studio well and truly on the map. Even more so than they have been with the wonderful Formula Hybrid, with the wonderful Formula RSS 2. This car really, to me, means that RSS have truly arrived. They've been able to prove themselves designing something modern. They've been able to prove themselves designing something generic, and now they've been able to prove themselves designing something retro, yet very, very special. This car, in the real-world iteration, the Lotus 79, has legions of admirers all around the world, and for all sorts of different reasons. Americans like this car because of Mario Andretti. The Brits like this car because of Lotus and Colin Chapman. And the real nerdy F1 fans like myself love this car because of that underbody ground effect aerodynamics. And I think RaceSim Studio have managed to capture all of that into their iteration of this in Formula 79. It's really great. It's something that I think everybody needs to get. And, once again, it well and truly sucks. We ran out of suck there for a moment. Coming back now. Also think the tires are wearing a bit. Not too bad though. About one more lap of fuel in this thing before it cries enough and leaves me stranded someplace in Sector 2. Now chipped into second here. I don't quite trust the tires anymore. They are going off. Grab third early. More gentle on the throttle now. But still with the high speed stuff, plenty of grip. No problem. No problem at all. It's that ground effect. See, that's the ground, and it's having an effect. Ground effect. Just like that. So easy. Oh yes, this is one special car, I'm going to say that. It's going to be very popular online, I think. It's already pretty popular on YouTube. There are a lot of people who have already put videos out. The videos that I've already made of it have already received a pretty good reception, I must say, so yeah. This one's here to stay. Came onto the scene. I was initially perplexed as to why RSS would change their focus so drastically from making modern cars now to making a very vintage one, but it works. It really works. They've done it again. They really have. They've made a car that really, truly sucks. It's great. It's absolutely great. I'll stop with the bad suck puns because, yeah, it doesn't suck in the figurative sense. It sucks in the literal sense, which means it's absolutely awesome. Yeah, it is. I love this thing. I really, really do. It's a great addition to the Assetto Corsa lineup, and it's here to stay, like I said. I think it's really going to be popular among leagues and just general online track days and races for fun. It really is an awesome car, and it's an interesting subject too because of the historic nature of the Lotus 79 on which the car is obviously based, and just being able to implement it in a sim like Assetto Corsa that does have support for underbody aero, for active aero, things like that. This car really, I think, is at home in Assetto Corsa, and also Assetto Corsa is very kind to historic cars as well. Kunos made a whole lineup of historic cars of their own, and modders have fun with historic cars, particularly cars that have some interesting aero traits, like underbody aero, like ground effect. Please continue to make cars like this, because they are a lot of fun. Also, RSS, if you're listening to me, I have a challenge for all of you. You've made this car a ground effect wing car. The Lotus 79, Formula 79, I know. However, I did mention those active underbody aero, those active ground effect cars before, the Chaparral 2J and the Brabham BT46B. Please consider making a Brabham BT46B. That would be really cool. I know it would be a very big challenge because we don't have a lot of video of that car running, and as far as I know, there is only one left in the world that's still in running order because it shows up at Goodwood every couple of years. But if you do want to continue making some historic Formula 1 type cars, have a look at making the BT46B. Active aero, the big fan at the back, that would be really something. I think we would all love to experience something like that. So if you're still thinking about this, please, I do implore you to at least consider making a Brabham BT46 because that would be really, really cool. And it'd be really cool to put that car up against this one and see just who is really quicker. So yes, RSS, if you are listening, please, maybe a BT46B. Please? Thank you. All right, enough of my shameless asking for things that I want. To all of you, yes, of course, hot laps are to come from this video, so please stay tuned for those. They're here at Mugello. They do not have any commentary. You'll get onboard and external views of those hot laps as well. However, before I end, I do, of course, want to extend all of my thanks and all of my gratitude to all of you for continuing to support me and continuing to support the channel. It's difficult for me to make videos lately because I've got a very busy job, and this review is a little bit of a rush production, so hopefully that doesn't come out so much in the editing. But yeah, I don't have a whole lot of time to be making videos, and I try my best, but thank you all very much for your continued support and your continued engagement. I do really like interacting with all of you, so please do keep it up. I really do enjoy it, and of course, it is a humbling experience for me to be able to reach out to all of you all around the world. This humble little American who should have no business knowing anything about Formula One, making videos about Formula One, and being able to interact with a whole worldwide audience of Formula One fans. It's really awesome. Thank you so much for your continued support. However, thank you also for your patience because, yep, hot laps are now going to come. So stand by for the hot laps here from Mugello with the Formula 79 from RaceSim Studio. Until next time, though, signing off from the commentary side for RMan601, saying thank you very much for watching, and we will see you soon.